Your hand reaches before you do. Eyes barely open, you already know where the phone is. Not because you decided to check it, but because your body learned the route, the way a river learns a canyon. Palm closes around glass. The screen wakes up faster than you can. And the day begins with input. A flood of alerts that look urgent, until you realize they are only loud. You tell yourself you will deal with them later. The promise is always later, because later is where discipline lives, in theory, and never has to show up in practice. Your thumb starts moving. Swipe, refresh, open, close, swipe again. 30 seconds ago, you were asleep. Now you are absorbing other people's emergencies, other people's conflicts, other people's curated happiness and public rage. You have not generated a single clean thought yet. You are reacting. You are consuming. You are letting a machine pick your first emotion. Even in the shower, your mind does not become yours. It runs the same loops it ran yesterday. A future confrontation you will never have. A speech you rehearse in steam. The moment you finally win. The moment you finally prove something. The water ends, and the fantasy ends with it. Breakfast happens, and you barely taste it. Your mouth does its work, while your head continues the same inventory of fear. Money, health, time, status. The strange sound the car made last week. The look your partner gave you that might have meant something. The plan you abandoned months ago that still charges your card, like a monthly donation to guilt. Then you commute. Certain intersections trigger certain thoughts as reliably as traffic lights. A stop sign reminds you of an unpaid bill. A merge lane fills you with the dread of the workday. You are not in control of your day or thoughts. You are watching a script activate in sequence, and by the time you arrive, you have already lived this morning 100 times. You can predict the first conversation before it happens. Someone approaches the coffee machine and reaches for language that belongs to nobody. How was your weekend? Good. You? Nobody hears it. Nobody means it. It is verbal paperwork, a ritual of surface-level connection that exists so everyone can pretend they have checked in with humanity. Someone adds a line about the weather. Someone mentions a game. The group nods because nodding is the easiest way to communicate membership without revealing anything real. And if you are honest, you do it too. You might roll your eyes internally. You might tell yourself you are different, more awake, more thoughtful than the room. But the contempt is not a rebellion. It is another uniform. It is the same script, with a different mask. Even your depth often comes pre-packaged. The quotes you admire. The arguments you repeat. The confident takes that feel original until you trace where they came from. This is the quiet truth that stings. Your distance from the performance can become part of the performance. Meetings begin. The same slides reappear with new fonts. The same objections arrive on schedule, delivered with the familiar tone of someone playing a role they have played for years. Decisions are discussed that were decided elsewhere. Earlier, by people you will never meet, in rooms that will never include you. You speak anyway. You contribute anyway. You repeat phrases you learned to use because they sound professional, because they keep you safe, because they make you appear like a person who belongs inside the machine. And the most unsettling part is this. Even the way you sit, the way you pause before you speak, the phrasing of your emails, the way you try to look calm while you are not calm. Much of it is borrowed behavior, inherited posture, copied confidence, adopted mannerisms that once belonged to someone you watched and decided to imitate. A large portion of what you call self is simply what was rewarded. Listen to the voice that narrates your life. The constant commentary. The interpretation. The judgment. It sounds like you, but if you listen closely, it carries other people's accents. An old warning about money. A doubt about competence. A rule about what is acceptable. A memory of being corrected for asking too much. Those voices do not disappear because time passes. They fade into the background and become normal. They become your internal tone, and you forget they were installed. Not all of it was cruelty. Some of it sounded like love. Maybe you were told you were exceptional, that you were destined for something, that you were different in a way that made adults proud to know you. That kind of praise can become its own trap. A pedestal is still a cage. When a child is raised on the idea of being special, ordinary life begins to feel like failure. You are not allowed to simply be human. You must be impressive. And so, a second voice grows under the first. A desperate need to prove worth. A hunger for validation. A quiet fear that if you are not remarkable, you might be nothing. This is how programming survives. It does not need malice. It only needs repetition. You entered the world with raw potential. No story. No identity. No rules about what you are supposed to be. Then the first operating system arrived, usually through the people who raised you. They did not sit down and decide to shape you into something. They simply passed down what was normal to them. A normal is one of the most powerful forces in human behavior. It is the set of rules we follow without noticing we are following them. In early childhood, the brain builds an enormous number of connections. Then it trims what is not used, reinforcing whatever helps you survive your environment. Over time, those pathways become default settings. If love was unpredictable, you learned to scan for danger. If approval was conditional, you learned to perform. If attention arrived only when you were impressive, you learned to chase achievement. If boundaries were absent, you learned to float, hungry for structure. These are not mysterious personal flaws. They are predictable outcomes. The patterns you struggle with now often began as survival strategies that worked in the ecosystem you grew up in. Consider 3 common types of early programming. One version is the strict system. Rules were rigid. Questioning was punished. Approval felt tied to obedience. You learned to read moods like weather. You learned to shrink yourself. You learned that making mistakes was not a normal human experience. It was evidence you were failing as a person. Adults, shaped by this background, often become hyper-alert. They volunteer too quickly. They cannot say no without guilt. They interpret a neutral expression as disapproval. They treat authority as danger and approval as oxygen. Another version is the boundaryless system. No consistent structure. Rules that dissolved the moment emotions entered the room. Praise that came too easily, too constantly, without anchoring you to reality. In that environment, a child can become dependent on effortless validation. Difficulty becomes threatening, not because it is impossible, but because it risks puncturing the identity of being exceptional. Adults, shaped by this background, often crave feedback. They struggle with discipline. They oscillate between rebellion and desperate dependence on external guidance. Freedom can feel like abandonment. Peace can feel like neglect. Then there is the most disorienting version: inconsistency. Some days strict, some days permissive. Consequences that appeared randomly. Love that felt like a wheel you could not predict. That kind of environment produces adaptation as a lifestyle. You become a chameleon. You can fit into any room, mirror anyone, red shifts instantly. But you may not know who you are when nobody is watching. Hypervigilance becomes normal. Relaxation feels unsafe. You apologize before you speak. You over-explain because you learned that misunderstanding could become punishment. This is not weakness. It is conditioning. And conditioning creates predictability. Predictability makes you easy to manage, easy to sell to, easy to steer. Programming does not enter only through pain. Reward can program you as effectively as fear. If you are praised for being the achiever, you can become addicted to accomplishment. If you are praised for being the peacemaker, you can become allergic to conflict. If you are praised for being the funny one, you can become incapable of seriousness when seriousness is required. The brain records what earns safety and belonging. Then it repeats it. Over time, this becomes your personality. And layered over family programming is generational programming. Your era has its own defaults, its own marketing triggers, its own cultural malware. You may believe you are an exception, but most influence systems do not require personal history. They require demographic patterns. A birth year and a profile can tell a manipulator what you fear, what you crave, what language will make you soften, and what language will make you angry. Some cohorts were trained to worship endurance and loyalty. Some were trained to distrust institutions, while relying on them anyway. Some were trained to build identity through performance and optimization. Some were raised by algorithms and learned to process reality as a stream of content. The details vary, but the core mechanism is the same. When enough people share the same environment, they develop the same reflexes. Those reflexes become targeting instructions. Then the next layer arrives, almost universal, almost invisible, because it was given a noble name. Education. School is not only about learning facts. It is also a training ground for compliance. The structure itself teaches lessons. Bells teach you to obey external timing. Rows teach you to face forward and accept hierarchy. Permission teaches you to ask before you act. Grading teaches you that value is assigned by authorities. Standardization teaches you that the safest path is the approved one. A child who wants to move must sit still. A child who asks too many questions is disruptive. Curiosity becomes a behavior to manage rather than a flame to protect. Originality is tolerated only when it fits inside the rubric. Then the workplace continues the training. Emails that say nothing. Meetings that preserve power. Warehouse morning gatherings that are designed to pit employees against each other. Performance metrics that translate humanity into outputs. Culture fit, as a polite phrase for assimilation. The machine is especially effective because it can exploit any childhood operating system. If you were raised with strictness, you will overwork to earn approval. If you were raised without boundaries, the structure feels like safety. If you were raised in inconsistency, chaos feels familiar, and you become valuable for adapting. At a certain point, you do not need external enforcement. You enforce it internally. You measure your worth in productivity. You feel guilty resting. You equate busyness with identity. You feel selfish for doing things needed for self. And then the final layer moves into your pocket. A device that collapses work hours into all hours. A device that offers stimulation at the exact moment discomfort rises. A device built by people who study attention like engineers study steel. The phone is not neutral. It is a delivery system for compulsion. The average person checks it dozens, sometimes hundreds of times per day. Apps are designed to reward you unpredictably. The same principle that keeps gamblers at slot machines. A small payoff arrives at random intervals, and your brain learns to keep pulling the lever. Scroll. Refresh. Check again. You tell yourself it is choice, because nobody is forcing your hand. But persuasion does not require force. It requires a system that reliably captures you when you are tired, lonely, bored, anxious, or uncertain. And those states are not accidents. They are the ambient conditions of modern life. You live with constant stimulation and constant dread. Everything feels urgent, and very little feels meaningful. When you are calm, you can see the trap. When you are stressed, you reach for the fix. That gap between your rational intention and your emotional behavior is where the system makes its money. Your life becomes content. Your moments become raw material. Your attention becomes inventory. Your identity becomes a product optimized for likes, shares, and approval. You start seeing yourself through imagined eyes. You filter your choices through perception. You become the manager of your own image. This is a voluntary surveillance system. A modern panopticon where you guard yourself. And the most profitable outcome is not hatred or love. It is dependence. Dependence on validation. Dependence on distraction. Dependence on being told what to think, what to fear, what matters, what is happening, and who you should be. The theft is subtle because it does not feel like theft. It feels like normal. That is why it works. The deeper problem is not that influence exists. Influence is inevitable. The deeper problem is that most people never see the code running beneath their choices. Which means their freedom is largely a set of rehearsed reactions. If you can identify the patterns, you can interrupt them. Not with wishful thinking. Not with motivational slogans. With awareness that is sharp enough to become leverage. Because the person being influenced is always the last to know. And the moment you can observe your own programming without immediately defending it, you create a small space, a gap, a place where choice can finally enter. If this made you uncomfortable and resonated with you, let it be known. Subscribe, keep the lantern lit, and leave a comment below.